This video is of the other train-related stuff that I saw during my 2017 Colorado vacation. Stuff that isn't worth a whole video on its own. Starting with the Gunnison Colorado Pioneer Museum with Denver and Rio Grande Western 268. The museum wasn't open during my visit, but I was able to see the train from the street. Number 268 is a Class C16 Baldwin 280 built in 1882. This locomotive has been on display in Gunnison since 1955. Also on display behind 268 is Flanger Car OD. I saw another flanger at Silverton on my trip. There's also this old black crossbuck, complete with lights and bell. There's also side dump gondola car 710, boxcar 3633, livestock car 5763, and caboose 0589. There's also this maintenance of way flat car and the original water tower and depot. The museum also has other historic vehicles inside their buildings. We are now at the Salida Museum in Salida, Colorado, with this 040 locomotive. This engine is Copper's Company No. 40, a Porter locomotive built in 1926. This 2-foot gauge locomotive worked at a Thai creosoting plant near Salida, and the locomotive was donated to the museum in 1953. Thankfully, during my visit, they were redoing the fence so I could get close-ups of this weird thing, as well as the inside of the cab. It seems as though this locomotive worked with link and pin couplings. And of course, I got up inside the cab. As is typical of most park display locomotives, the levers and gauges are missing. Fortunately, this plate is still here and says the locomotive's boiler ran at 170 psi. This bin on the left side of the cab is where the coal was stored. This dynamo generator converted steam to electricity to power the headlight and was made by the Pyle National Company of Chicago. Since this locomotive is so small, I figured that the engineer would have sat on either side of the locomotive cab, so I took a picture of myself on both sides. Also behind this locomotive is an empty stretch of track. During my visit, I wondered if something else used to sit on these tracks. I eventually found out that this caboose used to be on display behind the locomotive. It is actually Denver and Rio Grande Western 576, which was rebuilt in the mid-1950s. The caboose was actually rebuilt by a private owner after World War II. Today, the caboose sits near the railroad tracks on North F Street in Salida. Number 40 is this semaphore signal. This type of signal was found at train stations to alert the crew if they had train orders to pick up. I also noticed this time capsule marker. At Salida, we join up with the Tennessee Pass line. This route hasn't been used since like 2000 and is currently used to store freight cars on. Trains now run through the Muffet Tunnel instead, which was also an ex-Rio Grande route. I expected cars that were stored on an abandoned track to look like this. Very worn paint, rust, and patches. So it really surprised me to see these MWAX ballast hopper cars. I believe they were also less than a year old too, and there were dozens of them. And there are also these center beams, which I figured were more common to be left out here. At the top of the Royal Gorge, where the Royal Gorge train terminates, is DRGW 499, a K37-282. This narrow gauge 282 is a 1930 rebuild of a standard gauge 280. 499 came to the Royal Gorge in 1980 after sitting in Alamosa Yard for many years. It replaced engine number 486, which is now operational at the Durango and Silverton. I even managed to edit this locomotive into black and white. And here's how it looks in color. we did not cross the Royal Gorge Bridge. Also along my trip in Colorado, I noticed quite a few old boxcars being used as farm sheds. Now I move on to the Royal Gorge Depot, where we see engine 2238, a GP7U. It was originally built in 1951 for the Santa Fe and arrived at the Royal Gorge in 2003. A lot of the passenger cars are ex-Via Rail or ex-McKinley Explorer repainted in a Rio Grande style livery. The full dome cars might be ex-Santa Fe or ex-Great Northern, maybe even ex-Milwaukee Road. I even noticed this one car had a horn and backup light. There are even a couple cars where they cut the middle out to be open view cars. The train wasn't due out for quite a while and I didn't have time to stick around and wait for it. This is car number 5581, the Theodore Roosevelt, originally built by Pullman in 1954 for the Canadian National. Number 3104 is a GP40, originally built in 1970 for the Western Pacific. Prior to coming to the Canyon City and Royal Gorge Railroad, it worked on the Wisconsin Central. There are also a couple of locomotives on display next to the depot. Number 402 is an F7A originally built for the Chicago Northwestern. This 1949 built EMD hasn't pulled a train since 2012, but the railroad has been working to restore the locomotive since 2019. Also on display is West Side Lumber Company Shea number 8. This narrow gauge engine was built by the Lima Locomotive Works in 1922. This locomotive has been on display in Canyon City since 2008, and the railroad has been looking for a new owner for it. It has been acquired by the Moffett Road Railroad Museum in Granby, Colorado, which I visited in 2021. Unfortunately, I did not see this locomotive during my visit. While many passengers chose to wait under the tents for their train ride, I chose to go inside the depot. This ex-Santa Fe depot is a relic from the time when it and the Denver and Rio Grande fought to build a route through the Royal Gorge. Inside the depot, there's this little display case. I like how not only are the passenger cars repainted in the Royal Gorge livery, one has been cut out to make an observation car. They also had quite a few bicentennial trains in multiple scales. I only knew of the Lionel one before I saw this case in person. Here's a nice comparison of the detail between the two scales. I was quite intrigued by this little Santa Fe locomotive that was the size of the Matchbox, and this painted saw blade and historic sign. And this nicely framed authentic Rio Grande jacket. And this page of the newspaper showing the early days of the Royal Gorge route when the cars were still in Via Rail blue. In the gift shop, I noticed they were selling these custom friction-powered trains. And this wind-up Zephyr toy. I got a Lionel version as a kid and I still have it. On my way out of town, I noticed this ex-Virginia Railway Express locomotive. Number V20 is a GP40PH-2. It was originally built in 1969 as a GP40 for the Atlanta and West Point. In the background of this image, there is an ex-Rio Grande caboose and an unrestored dome car. And that's all the train images and videos that I took in my vacation 2017. Please watch the rest of the playlist if you haven't.